Okay, so you've sent in a ton of stuff on the future of work, huh? Looks like you've been doing some serious research on how different industries might be changing. We've got articles, your own notes, and it seems like you're interested in everything from AI and automation to what's happening in retail, finance, all sorts of sectors. So in this deep dive, we're going to try to boil all that down to the most important takeaways for you, the stuff you really need to know.
Yeah, no, it's a really crucial area to be thinking about right now. And you've definitely got a good foundation here. It can be overwhelming with so much information out there. And so what we'll try to do is kind of synthesize it all, highlight the big trends, and really help you connect the dots.
Sounds good. So, how about we start with that 2013 Oxford study, the one by Frey and Osborne? It really seemed to kick off a lot of these conversations about automation, remember? It predicted that something like 47% of jobs could be automated in the next, 15, 20 years. What made that study so impactful?
Well, I think what really struck people about Frey and Osborne's work was that it wasn't just looking at automation in, factories and stuff like that. They analyzed over 700 different occupations,
Hmm.
and they ranked them by how likely they were to be automated. And suddenly, jobs that we always thought of as requiring uniquely human skills, lawyers, accountants, doctors, journalists, all these white-collar professions were facing the possibility of serious job displacement. Because what the study showed was that even a lot of those white-collar tasks, they were actually pretty routine or could potentially be done by algorithms, as they got more sophisticated.
Yeah, yeah. So it wasn't just about robots replacing factory workers anymore.
Right.
And I feel like we're seeing more and more examples of this kind of job displacement actually happening and even speeding up. I mean, the sources you sent in, they talked about how elevator operators and telephone operators, those jobs basically disappeared, right? But now it seems like things are moving even faster.
Definitely, yeah. That feeling that job disappearance is accelerating is real. I mean, just look around, right? Here in the U.S., you see parking lot cashiers being replaced by machines, and more airlines are doing self-check-in. And even in Japan, they have restaurants with conveyor belts instead of waiters. And there are even robots making sushi now. But it's not just about those manual tasks anymore. It's the wider impact, on white-collar jobs.
Uh-huh.
Journalists, travel agents, real estate agents, bankers, insurance agents, accountants, lawyers, even doctors. It's like almost no profession is totally safe.
That's kind of scary, actually. And that Oxford study, it predicted some pretty high risks for specific jobs too. I remember seeing numbers like over 90% for restaurant servers, receptionists, truck drivers, tour guides, real estate agents. I mean, that's huge. But there was also a lot of pushback, right? A lot of people were skeptical about those numbers.
Well, yeah. I mean, it does make you think, right? How do you square those really high percentages with the fact that some of these jobs, they seem to require very human skills. Like people are saying, okay, but how's a robot waiter going to handle like a really complicated order change or be friendly and make you feel welcome? And what about a self-driving truck? What happens when it encounters something totally unexpected on the road? The argument was that these jobs, they rely on improvisation, on creativity, on real human interaction
Mm.
in ways that a machine just couldn't replicate.
Yeah, and that argument about the human element, that's really interesting to me. Because it makes me think about other times in history when there were big technological shifts and people had those same kinds of concerns. Like, think about the automation of agriculture in the 19th century. I mean, that was a huge change. It's easy to forget how many people used to work on farms.
Absolutely. I mean, back then, mechanization led to huge job losses in agriculture. Millions of people were displaced from their jobs. But here's the thing. The overall population actually tripled during that time, and living standards went up. So what does that tell us? Well, I think it shows that even though technology can disrupt things and cause job losses, it also opens up the possibility for totally new industries, new kinds of jobs that we can't even imagine yet. I mean, think about all the jobs that exist today that didn't exist just 10 or 20 years ago. People managing social media, designing virtual reality experiences, developing AI algorithms. It's incredible. But it also makes you wonder, right? What were the key factors that allowed society to adapt to that huge shift in the workforce back then? And are those same factors in play today as we face this new wave of automation?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's amazing how quickly things change, right? I mean, things that seemed like science fiction just a few years ago are totally normal now, asking a virtual assistant for information, using a traffic app to get around. It's crazy to think that those were like out there ideas not so long ago. So maybe we should like zoom in a little bit and look at how this transformation is playing out in some specific areas. Let's start with finance.
Okay, sure. So one really interesting trend in finance is the rise of virtual banks. Places like Betterment.com, they don't have all the overhead of traditional banks, so they can offer lower fees and stuff. And then you've got all these online payment platforms, right? Square, Google Wallet, Apple Pay, Venmo people are using those for everyday transactions now. And that means they need traditional banking services less and less. I mean, some people are even predicting that, like half of all bank employees could lose their jobs in the next few years. And then there's the whole AI thing, right? You've got platforms like Kensho, which are using AI for financial analysis, and they can do in minutes what used to take teams of analysts days to do. They use these really sophisticated algorithms to find patterns and insights in huge data sets.
Wow. But it's not all doom and gloom in finance, is it? You mentioned ATMs earlier, and initially people thought those would put bank tellers out of work, but that didn't really happen, did it?
Right. That's a really important point. ATMs did automate a lot of those basic cash handling tasks, but that actually allowed banks to lower the costs of running their branches. And guess what? That led to banks opening more branches. So there was actually an increase in those less routine, more customer-facing banking jobs, things like sales and customer service, building relationships with clients. So
Yeah.
the nature of the work changed, but the total number of jobs didn't necessarily go down. And I think that's something to keep in mind. Looking ahead, it seems like financial advisors who have really specialized expertise, in complex situations or alternative investments, things like that, they're probably going to stay in demand.
Okay, that's good to know. So what about law? I mean, that's another profession that a lot of people thought would be pretty resistant to automation.
Yeah.
But it sounds like AI is making some pretty big inroads there, too.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, you've got AI tools like Kira systems, which are being used by big law firms now to analyze contracts. Basically, they use natural language processing to sift through all that legal jargon and identify the important clauses and stuff, which can take, junior lawyers forever to do manually. And then there are all these online legal services like LegalZoom and Rocket Lawyer, which let people and small businesses handle basic legal stuff themselves. So that's obviously impacting the work of paralegals and even some lawyers. And there have been some pretty dire predictions about job losses in the legal sector, tens of thousands in the UK alone, and potentially way more than that. And even blockchain technology, which, is basically this secure, decentralized digital ledger that could disrupt things like real estate transactions and buying and selling cars, because it can automate all that record keeping and transfer of ownership stuff, which could mean fewer lawyers and notaries are needed in those areas.
Wow, okay. But I've also heard that there's some resistance to these changes within the legal profession itself.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, the legal profession, like a lot of, well-established fields, it tends
Yeah.
to be pretty traditional, right? There's this whole model of expertise and how you get your credentials. And that's being challenged by all this new technology. And you do see some pushback, like there have been some cases where law firms have resisted working with those online legal service providers. So, it's definitely a bit of a tension between the old way of doing things and all these new possibilities. But I think the overall trend is pretty clear. Those more routine legal tasks, they're ripe for automation.
So let's move on to medicine. It feels like there are some really big changes on the horizon there with all this talk about data-driven medicine and AI.
Yeah, and it's really exciting. What we're seeing is a shift away from medical practice that's based mostly on, a doctor's experience and intuition, which is still important, of course, but now is moving more towards being driven by data. AI can analyze huge amounts of medical information from digital sensors, at-home diagnostic devices, all kinds of things. And that could lead to, earlier diagnoses, more accurate diagnoses. And then you've got robots being used more and more in surgery, which can make procedures more precise and less invasive. So the role of doctors is changing, It's becoming more about monitoring all this data, interpreting the insights that the AI is generating, and really focusing on that personalized advice and support for patients, that human connection. Doctors who don't embrace these new tools and adapt to this changing role, they might find themselves becoming less relevant.
Okay, wow. So many changes. And what about journalism? Another field that's facing a lot of upheaval, right? The rise of digital news, the challenges of making money online, and now AI is even writing news stories.
Right. Think about tools like Heliograph at the Washington Post. They can actually generate news reports automatically for things like election results. And AI can also help journalists with research, with drafting articles, even with coming up with new story ideas. So the future of news It seems like it's going to be a lot more integrated, combining text and audio and video, interactive graphics. And it'll be interesting to see how it all evolves. And then you've got this rise of individual content creators, YouTubers, athletes who are using their own platforms to connect directly with their audience. I mean, that could have a big impact on traditional sports journalism, for example. So it's really about how we consume information, right?
Yeah.
And how that's changing. And the role of journalists, it's shifting away from just, generating content. AI can handle a lot of that now, those more factual reports. So human journalists can focus more on things like investigative journalism, in-depth analysis, really providing context and understanding.
But you also mentioned that the Washington Post, they actually grew and hired more people despite all this automation. So maybe it's not all bad news for journalists.
Yeah, exactly. So the Washington Post, they invested really heavily in their digital presence. And they used tools like heliograph to cover those more routine events more efficiently. And what happened? Well, their readership went up,
Mhm.
and they ended up hiring more journalists. But those journalists could focus on, higher level tasks, investigative reporting, those in-depth features that really require human intelligence and creativity. So it shows that technology, it doesn't always have to be about replacing people. It can be a tool for augmentation, for expansion.
I like that. Augmentation. Okay, so let's switch gears again and talk about how we buy things and how we eat, because retail and food service, they're going through some massive changes too, right? Driven by automation.
Totally. I mean, think about all the self-service kiosks you see now in restaurants, right?
Hmm.
McDonald's, Chili's, Applebee's, Panera, they're all doing it. Automating ordering and payment. And it's not just about replacing waiters anymore. There's very real possibility that robots could start replacing chefs too. And then you got the whole e-commerce thing, right? Amazon has had a huge impact on traditional brick and mortar stores like Macy's, and online retail just requires less labor in physical stores. So we've got things like cashierless stores like Amazon Go, and robots doing inventory management in places like Lowe's.
So basically the whole experience of going shopping is going to change, right? And you mentioned virtual and augmented reality. How are those going to play into all this?
Well, imagine this, right? You're at home, you put on a VR headset, and you can actually experience products like walk around them, see them in 3D, all from your living room. And then with augmented reality, you could see how a piece of furniture would look in your house, or try on clothes virtually to see how they fit. So you might not even need to go to a store for a lot of things anymore, which means that physical stores, they're going to have to offer something special, something you can't get online.
Right.
And salespeople, they're going to have to become more like expert advisors, kind of like what Apple and Best Buy are trying to do, focusing on knowledge and personalized service instead of just, ringing people up.
Makes sense. And speaking of changing experiences, transportation is another huge area that's about to be totally disrupted, right? With self-driving cars and trucks.
Yeah, this is a really big one. I mean, you've got all these companies, Tesla, Google, Uber, Lyft. They're all working on self-driving vehicles. And it could really revolutionize how we get around, make things safer, more efficient. But of course, it also means that jobs like taxi drivers and truck drivers are at risk. Some experts are even saying that, eventually driving in cities will just seem like dangerous and old-fashioned. And of course, there's going to be resistance, especially from unions, but the economic incentives are really strong. Autonomous vehicles could make transportation so much cheaper, improve logistics so much. It's hard to see how that trend's going to be stopped.
Yeah, it does feel inevitable. And finally, in terms of industries, what about manufacturing? I've been hearing a lot about reshoring, bringing manufacturing back to developed countries, and how robots and 3D printing are changing things there.
Yeah, so reshoring is definitely a trend, and automation is a big part of why that's happening. Industrial robots are getting more sophisticated and cheaper all the time. And then you've got things like 3D printing, which companies like Adidas are using to make shoes in automated factories.
Yeah.
So local production is becoming more competitive, even without, super cheap labor. But that also means that the demand is shifting towards people who have the skills to program and operate and maintain these machines, skilled technicians. And there's actually a potential shortage of those kinds of workers because, there's still this perception that vocational training isn't as good as a 4-year college degree.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we've talked about a lot of potential job displacement across all these different sectors. It's kind of overwhelming, honestly. It makes you wonder what the bigger picture is for society, for all of us.
Mm.
You mentioned Nick Bostrom and his idea about universal basic income and how our whole idea of work might change.
Yeah, Bostrom makes a really interesting point. He says that that maybe a world where lots of people are unemployed because of automation, maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe it could even be like a wonderful thing.
Mhm.
He argues that as machines take over more and more of the tasks that we consider work right now, both the physical and mental tasks, well, maybe our whole concept of work, our idea that it's like the center of our lives and gives us meaning and structure, maybe that will change. He suggests that, maybe a super productive robot-driven economy could actually generate enough wealth to give everyone a basic income. And if that happened, well, then we'd have to really rethink what we consider a valuable or fulfilling life.
Hmm.
Right. And he's not just like making this up. He points to real world examples like, think about students or even certain segments of society in places like Saudi Arabia, where not having a traditional job isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you also mentioned the idea of maybe requiring community service as a kind of alternative to traditional employment in a future like that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because there's actually some scientific research that shows that doing altruistic things, helping other people, it actually triggers pleasure centers in the brain.
Yeah.
So, it's possible that we could find meaning and purpose and contribute to society in ways that aren't about, getting paid for a job.
That's a cool thought. So given all these changes, all this potential disruption, what should people be focusing on? What skills do we need to develop to like stay relevant and thrive in this new world? You mentioned soft skills earlier.
Yeah, soft skills are going to be huge as machines take over more and more of those routine tasks
Yeah.
and even some of the complex cognitive tasks. Well, the things that make us uniquely human, those are going to become even more valuable. Things like creativity, curiosity, critical thinking, emotional intelligence. Those are the areas where we still have a big advantage over machines. And just being adaptable, being a lifelong learner, those are going to be key skills too. And there's this great quote from Benjamin Pring. He says, "Look for the waves of the future and surf them." Love that.
That's great advice. So what are some of those waves of the future that Pring identified for people who are thinking about their careers and, where they want to go?
Well, he highlighted fields like biotechnology, quantum computing, which is, a whole different kind of computing that could solve problems that even our most powerful computers can't handle right now.
That's it too.
And then cybersecurity, virtual and augmented reality, space exploration, preventative medicine, and wellness. Those are all areas where he sees a lot of potential. But the bigger message, I think, is to follow your passions, and be open to the possibility that you might have to reinvent yourself a few times throughout your career.
Yeah, makes sense. But
Yeah.
it's not all rosy, right? There's a potential downside to all this technology too. You mentioned the dark side.
Right. I mean, we have to be honest about those concerns too. Technology addiction is a real thing, and it can have some really negative impacts on mental health, isolation, attention problems, even depression. And there's a growing movement for tech companies to be more responsible, to really think about those potential consequences. We need to find a balance, right? We need to make sure that technology serves us, not the other way around.
Absolutely. But you also ended on a note of optimism, right? Looking at some of the positive trends in the world, even with all these challenges.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, despite all the disruption that automation is causing, it's important to remember that technology has also led to some incredible improvements in global well-being. We've seen a huge decline in poverty, in famines, in wars. There are more democracies in the world now, and overall, people are living longer, healthier lives. And technology has played a big part in that.
Yeah, it's good to keep that in mind. So to kind of wrap things up for you, our listener, it seems like the key takeaway here is that automation and AI, they're going to reshape the world of work. They're going to change a lot of industries, and it's going to be both challenging and exciting. A lot of jobs are going to disappear, but new ones are going to be created, and our whole understanding of what work means might change too. It's a lot to process.
It is, but the good news is that we have some control over how we respond to these changes. If we focus on adaptability, on continuous learning, and on developing those uniquely human skills like creativity and critical thinking well, then we can navigate this changing landscape and even thrive.
It makes me think of something the painter Fernando de Cislo said. Someone asked him why he was still painting so intensely when he was in his 90s, and he said, "Because I still haven't painted the perfect picture I've always dreamed of painting." And to me, that speaks to this idea of always striving for mastery, and how our passions can guide us through all these changes. So as you think about all this, our listener, what are you most curious about? What are you excited about? What are you worried about? It's definitely something to keep thinking about.
Yeah. Definitely food for thought. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.